Hi, everyone, and welcome to Entry Planning for Equity-Focused Leaders, Empowering Schools and Communities Book Talk. A reminder that chat is disabled for attendees, but if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A feature below. I would like to introduce the authors who have joined us here today. Jennifer Perry Cheatham is a senior lecturer on education, co-chair of the Public Education Leadership Project, and an alumna of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Rodney Thomas is founder and president of his own consulting practice, Center Forward, and former Chicago public school teacher and administrator. Ed.M. Parrott-Sheffer is also an alum of HGSE and managing partner at Postscript Coaching and Consulting, as well as strategy advisor to Harvard's DataWise project and co-chair of the DataWise in Action Institute. Jen, you can take it from here.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. It is just wonderful to be here to talk about our new book, Entry Planning for Equity-Focused Leaders, which I have right here in my hands. We hope that this is going to be a practical contribution to the field at a crucial time when there is unprecedented turnover in education leadership and a generation of students who need us not to skip a beat. You know, a friend and colleague of mine recently said, actually posted this on Facebook. He said, I can't even begin to recount the number of times in my career that leadership transitions slowed or stopped improvements for students and families. It seems like every time there's momentum for greatness to emerge, a transition happens to impede it. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this pattern seems to happen more frequently among efforts to ensure a brilliant education for students of color. So as much as leadership turnover poses a tremendous challenge, we, meaning me, Rodney Thomas and Ed.M. Parrott-Sheffer, think it also presents an opportunity to embrace and practice a more nuanced approach to leadership entry, one that might lay the foundation for kind of transformational change our communities deserve. So in our little bit of time together, I have a feeling this is going to go fast. We thought we would share something about ourselves, introduce the main concepts in the book, and then engage in a discussion about some of the more nuanced aspects of leadership entry, saving, of course, a bit of time toward the end for questions, because we'd love to hear from everyone who is here with us today. So let me start by saying what an absolute pleasure it was to write this book with my colleagues, Rodney Thomas and Ed.M. Parrott-Sheffer. These are two people I've known since our days working in the Chicago public schools, all of us practitioners at heart. While we drew on many sources while writing the book, including dozens of interviews with leaders in the field, of course, a full review of the literature on the subject, we all drew in part on our own experiences with leadership entry. Ed.M. as a former principal, Rodney as a former central office and education nonprofit leader, and of course, my own experience as a school and district leader and former superintendent. So we thought it might be nice for each of us to start with a quick story that demonstrates something that we learned about our own, through our own experience with leadership entry. And Ed.M., I would love for you to get us started.
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this, I was going back to my first principalship, which was an interim job, which meant the whole year was interviewing pretty much for the role. And I was much younger then, even than I am now, and coming into a role where there had been uncertainty in the previous leadership and the experience that people had. And I remember, you know, scripting these questions and thinking about what the sort of interview questions I was going to ask everybody and sharing them in advance and having a calendar and having all of these pieces. And for me, it was this moment where, you know, there were some self things about who I was as a leader, showing up as young, showing up as a white male in this space, as well as the needs of the school. And so this ability to have a more structured process really mattered in the moment. And, you know, I remember a teacher coming into one of those meetings with me and just saying, thank you for doing this. It is so nice to hear in this way. And, you know, the second, you know, I made a joke about Doogie Howser at one of my first staff meetings. And, you know, the teacher came to me and said, The second you did that, I knew we were going to be okay. The fact that you knew who you were showing up as and how we might think of you, and were willing to, joke about it, really mattered for us in the moment. And like, I wouldn't have known to do that without those early interviews that really let me experience the school from other people's perspectives. And I know, Rodney, I know you've got similar leadership experiences jumping into this work too.
Yeah, I didn't talk about Doogie Howser, Adam, but there were some things. I think one of the major leadership lessons for me was I leaned a lot on my identity as a Black man. And I can remember entering into a new community and making an assumption that because I identified as a Black male, that it was going to be easy for me to connect with the Black community. And that wasn't so. For me, what happened was, even as I identified as a Black man, I was considered an outsider within that context, right? And so there was intentional work that I had to do in very unstructured ways of building relationships. So I remember extending an invitation for myself to anyone in the community that wanted to have dinner, and not dinner at a restaurant, but like dinner in their homes, right? Like sitting down at their tables and having conversations and being vulnerable about who I am, and talking to them about what their hopes and things were in those particular spaces. And so it was very unstructured ways of making intentional connections. What about you, Jen?
Yeah, you both have me thinking so much. I love hearing these stories again. Adam, you being who you are, needing to have a highly structured approach that built legitimacy, right? Rodney, you intentionally choosing to create a more unstructured approach because it needs to be about kind of relationship building, and to some degree without authority, which is something we might get into later. For me, I'm thinking about my superintendent leadership entry, right? Lots of authority in that role. But I knew coming in that my entry was in itself a disruptive event, right? I knew that I had to approach it in a way that wasn't going to do more harm. And the intentionality of caring for a community every step of the way was front and center for me. But I think even more, I realized that the routines that I wanted to introduce early on, right, these ones that were maybe more humane, were ones that I wanted to keep going, that I was using my leadership entry to introduce new ways of working, right? To create conditions that would make it possible for the district to make progress later on. So just a quick example. One of the many things that I did was to meet with an ongoing group of teachers. And that same group I met with for the 6.5 years, obviously changing a little bit over time as teachers come and go, right? But the routine that I introduced in those early weeks stood the test of time. And it was incredibly important for me, not only to get their insight coming in, but their insight every step of the way. So leadership entry is a way to introduce routines, was a major lesson for me that I would love to share with everybody else. So, okay. Thank you, Adam and Rodney. Let's talk a little bit about the kind of nuts and bolts of leadership entry and what we learned that people can learn more about in the book. And then we'll open up for some more discussion. So the book builds on the great work of colleagues like Barry Jentz. Each of us used Barry Jentz's guidance at some point during our careers, very good guidance, who recommend that leaders should structure their leadership entry into clear and predictable phases over something like a 90-day period, give or take, depending on context. And we too recommend clear and distinct phases and related steps, which are all outlined in our book. Of course, there are some things that leaders should do before they've even started the job. That includes gathering kind of any and all available data, getting more familiar with local context and key players, right? This is often called pre-entry work, and that is an important phase. We also think that the next phase is the sort of the heart of leadership entry, is what we do to listen and learn in our community. This is like an inquiry phase, right? Leaders introduce themselves, but more importantly, they introduce their leadership entry plan. They engage then with a variety of stakeholders in perspective gathering about strengths and challenges and opportunities in both the organization that they work with and the community it serves. They make sense out of the data they've gathered, and they communicate back what they've learned. That happens in this listening and learning phase. And then for many, there is a natural segue into a third phase, which is often focused on strategy development and action planning. Not everyone has to do that, but there's often momentum that gets started in the listening and learning phase that very naturally leads to strategy development. So those are the three phases in a nutshell. In our book, however, and let's go to the next slide, we wanted to better understand the nuanced moves that leaders make within those phases when the goal is to empower a community to make equity-focused change, which means helping everyone, not just the leader, everyone identify the invisible structures, policies, and behaviors that sustain unequal outcomes and create new ways of working that open up the possibility for every child and family to thrive. And as we were writing the book, we realized that there were some big shifts that we wanted to make from the usual ways of structured leadership entry. For example, we realized that equity-focused leadership entry would require not only looking outward to understand organizational and community context, which is typical, but inward at who we are in relationship to that context, including thinking deeply about how we're perceived by the community. We realized that leadership entry for equity would require not only sharing our own personal core values, again, which is typical in leadership entry, but considering deeply the values of the communities we serve. We would have to focus less on diagnosis of problems, which again is typical in structured leadership entry, but focus more on the identification of problems only in relationship to our community's aspirations. And we would need to do more than communicate our themes and findings, typical of leadership entry, but instead use the opportunity to change the narrative, inspire hope, name hard truths when necessary. And finally, just one more example of a shift that we realized that we would need to make. We would want to use our leadership entry to do more than propel action. There's a lot of pressure to take action. And of course, we do want to be action oriented, but more importantly, we wanted to use that momentum to galvanize a community for positive change. So these are subtle but important shifts in the way that we think we should be thinking about this wonderful opportunity called leadership entry. So in addition to providing clear guidance on the phases of leadership entry, we developed this new framework that we think better articulates a set of dimensions that should guide the design of leadership entry from start to finish. This framework is based on our review of the literature, those empathy interviews that we conducted with equity-focused leaders about the nuances of their approach. And ultimately, it really captures the theory of action about leadership entry. So bear with me, but I want to try to capture this. If the leader looks inward to understand their identity and multiple identities, as well as outward to understand the context of the community they serve, if the leader commits to transparency in the process and actively builds trust along the way, if the leader centers the voices of those who are most experiencing the problems, listens with empathy to multiple perspectives and develops a shared and compassionate understanding of the organization's strengths, challenges, and opportunities, if the leader uses this shared understanding to tell an honest narrative about the organization and galvanizes community for collective action, and provides space for healing, self-care, and care of others along the way, then the leader is more likely to set in motion an equity-focused change effort that can lead to sustainable change. Now, we realize that this is a tall order, right? This is the work of leadership. But without attention to these nuances, we worry that a structured entry process is more likely to simply replicate the system as it exists. So that's kind of the big ideas of the book in a nutshell. But let's dig a little bit deeper. We're going to open it up for some discussion between the three of us as co-authors, and then we'll open it up for Q&A so we can unearth more about what we've learned through writing the book. So why don't we take down the slides and so we can see each other's faces during this conversation. And we're just going to do a quick whip around between me, Rodney, and Ed.M. And I'd like for us to start with just a few quick words on the importance of transparency and trust building. Right, this is one of the major dimensions that we explore in the book. What does transparency and trust building look like during entry? Why is it especially important now? And what have you learned about building trust across difference? Yeah. You know, I'd love for someone else to go first. Rodney or Ed.M, do you want to kick it off?
I'll start.
Okay.
I think what I learned about transparency and trust and how it looks during entry is being vulnerable. Like, I think we ask as system leaders, our communities, to be vulnerable, and I think we have to first model what that means. As it relates to transparency and trust building. So I think sharing truths about our own fears and our challenges, aspirations, and hope, both as an individual and as a leader of systems, right? Like, and I use that intentionally, like as individuals, like I want you to get to know me as a person outside of the role, right? That holds a lot of position and a lot of power, right? So I think that's key. I think it's important now just because of the political and social context that we're in, right? Like there's a lot of harm that's been done to our communities across the country. And I think that we have to lead from both a place of head and heart, right? Like the technical aspect of leadership is extremely important. It's the way in getting things done. But we also don't forget that people live in our systems, right? And so we have to make the experience humanizing. And specifically as it relates to building trust across differences, I think if you listen deeply with your heart, that you'll find that most people want similar things, right? But what gets in the way is when you skip this step of building trust and transparency, the outcome or the consequences of doing this is hurt and pain, right? We hear it, right? We hear anger, we hear frustration, and we hear all the things because we haven't taken an intentional pause to be able to build authenticity through trust and vulnerability.
I love that, Rodney. I'm going to chime in and then I'll pass it over to Ed.M to round out this first question. But I love what you said about vulnerability. I'm right there with you, Rodney. Selective vulnerability, for sure. You know, in the book, we highlight Breikenschneider's research on relational trust. You know, these are not new ideas, but I think the pandemic has taught us just how important they are, given that we are interdependent, right? We depend on one another. So in my mind, transparency and trust building in leadership entry are just inextricably linked. This is why we recommend sharing your entry plan, because trust is built in part through the demonstration of what that research says, competence, integrity, right? Vulnerability. And when you follow through on the promises that you've made, including promises that you've made in your entry plan, and keep people updated along the way, it sends a message that you're someone who follows through, right? And that you're not only like you're expressing your vulnerability in part by putting back out there what you think you're learning, right? With the idea that you're not necessarily right? That you're open to feedback and looking to continually fine tune your interpretation of what's happening in the organization of the community. Adam, what do you think about trust and transparency?
Yeah, so I mean, this idea of vulnerability and the part that you share, so critical, both beforehand as you walk in the door and as you're saying, Jen, this piece where as you're learning, testing your assumptions, showing that you know that you don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
I think one of the powerful things we learned from some of the leaders was that actually happens in the actions you take as well, right? Like there's these moments where you think one thing should happen and folks on your team are saying it should look differently. This is what we're seeing. And in that moment, you can be the leader and make your decision, or you can be vulnerable and take the risk to allow space for others. And like, and we had leaders who did this, right? We had leaders that we talked to who, shared this need to like, I think it's going to go in this way, but when it came down to the decision-making process, they mirrored how people in that school made decisions, and they stepped back and said, I think it might be this, but if that's really the curricular move they want to make, let's try it. And how can I be clear about what I need to see at the end? And like that willing to trust other people was so powerful in those moments and in their own leadership. And it reminds me of, the conversation that we got to have with Zaretta Hammond about these ideas, that like, it's so important, particularly when you're leading across difference, to start mirroring the culture and norms of the organization and figure out how to bring those into the work. But to do that well, you've got to kind of know yourself and you got to know them. And I'd love to kind of shift gears a little bit. And Rodney, I don't know if you're willing to take the first stab at this one, but, we've talked to people a lot about, multiple identities and how their different identities show up in the work, and how it influences the way they're both perceived and the way that they do things. But, what does it look like when you're really doing the work? How do you practice self-awareness? Like, how do you really know who you are as you show up to these roles?
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam. And it's difficult, right? Like, I think for me, it is a shift in mindset that as a leader, I have to first grapple with, I don't have all the answers. I have to find a space of reflection to be able to shift how I think about how I'm showing up in spaces, particularly as we think of traditional leadership models, that I am savior, I have the answers, right? And even in my own identity, that I know really well what my community needs, right? And so I think the shift is about being able to disrupt or ask myself the question, am I willing to hear, see, and engage differently, right? Am I willing to hear a different thing than what aligns with my own identities, right? Like, am I willing to hear it differently and to be able to engage differently based on my own set of identities, right? And that requires just intentionality of pausing, but even in addition to just pausing and doing that type of reflection, there is also some sense of accountability, like surrounding yourself with people that gives you that will give you truths, right, about your own self, right? And so I think it's about engaging with and building a community of trusting colleagues that can call you on the thing, right? I think that is extremely important and necessary.
And is that what we're like, what moves would you recommend to people to do that now, right? Like, I feel like this goes to that analogy, right? Like the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is today. So as you think about like folks who are on the call, like what should they do to help build this community? What asks could they make?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the ask is like, I think I'll go back to what I said. I think it's being vulnerable, right? Like, I think it is just really being completely transparent about what you know, what you don't know, the support that you need, right? And also, I think in those spaces, just being very clear about asking people that as leaders, like to join you along the journey, right? And people care deeply about what they care about in their communities, and people want to help, right? So I think the ask is, I'm looking for support and help. I don't have all the answers, right? And I think people respect that when you are vulnerable in that way.
Yeah, I love that. I just wanted to chime in. Rodney has been that person for me. And I hope that I've, over the years, been that person for you sometimes, Rodney, right? So finding accountability partners who can kind of hold up a mirror, I agree, is just crucial. And I'm also thinking about some of the people we've interviewed, like Nancy Gutierrez, who you interviewed, Rodney, about not only having like a kitchen cabinet, like a group of people who really knew her new context and could guide her and help her make sense of it in relationship to who she was. But also she had this group called like her homies group, right? Like her really good friends who could just tell her like it is, right? Which I think you're getting at. So powerful to have those groups of people in your life. And potentially like an executive coach, which I know you're big on, and I am too.
Yeah, that's right. And it's really hard too for leaders, as speaking as a leader of color, like it's a very difficult place to be in, to constantly uphold your identity in every move that you do. It's difficult, right? Like, as you even think about how leaders, specifically leaders of color, are experiencing our current context and time, like to show up and not lose self,
Yeah.
right, in that, not lose your own identity, is a really, really difficult thing to carry.
So having spaces that are protective,
Yes.
right? Sense-making spaces that kind of bolster you.
Yep.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, very important. So I have a question. I have a question for Jen. If I could ask Jen this question. So how do you listen with empathy, stay engaged, and cultivate understanding, especially when there are opposing opinions or you disagree?
Yeah, it's not easy.
Yeah.
This is a great question because in leadership entry, there's such a huge emphasis on listening, right? I mean, this gets back to trust building too, right? Listening is an expression of respect, right? Which leads to trust building. So crucial to do it and to do it well, but it's not always easy. There's a lot that comes to my mind. I mean, the idea of listening with empathy, when we were writing the book, we really kind of dug into this idea of empathy, not just any kind of listening, but listening with empathy, which means that you have to be able to hold multiple points of view, both cognitively, but also emotionally, right? It is just not easy to do. And we also talk in the book about how important it is, while listening, to center the voices of non-dominant communities, right? Voices that often don't get heard deeply and empathetically. It doesn't mean you aren't listening to everybody else, but it is very important to center the voices of those who are most experiencing the problems in your organization, in your community. But when you're listening to those stories and those voices, for some leaders who have had similar experiences, the process of listening can even be re-traumatizing. At the very least, it's depleting, right? It actually depletes your energy. especially when the things that you're hearing may conflict with your own personal beliefs. It's just a real challenge. And I think in our conversations with leaders, I learned quite a lot about, what's the word that I'm looking for? Anticipating when that will happen, right? Sometimes it happens by surprise, like you're not expecting it, but oftentimes you can actually anticipate it, right? The way you structure it, building in time afterwards, right? For processing, thinking, walking, breathing, right? Don't schedule really challenging listening sessions back to back if you can avoid it. It's just hard on you, emotionally, physically, mentally. I've found that sharing responsibility can be important depending on who the audience is, right? Members of your team, it depends on the kind of leadership position you have, can kind of step up into a difficult conversation that might be especially hard for you, or vice versa. I'm happy to give some examples of that, but I think that's important. Going for balance, right? Listening sessions that kind of uplift you, as well as listening sessions that will maybe be depleting, right? These are things that we can anticipate. One tool that I found to be incredibly helpful was this mindful listening tool in Shane Saphir's book called The Listening Leader. It's phenomenal. Simple, but phenomenal, right? But she recommends, before going into what you imagine will be a difficult listening session, to prepare. Think about who you are in that conversation, right? What biases might you be bringing? What are your expectations of the experience? Then she asks you to put your feet in the other person's shoes, right? What are they bringing to the conversation? What biases may they be bringing? What expectations are they bringing? And then kind of thinking about how you both, you and the group, or you and the other person, are situated in a larger context, which includes power differentials, right? And then what does that mean for how I'm going to show up in this conversation? I think preparation is important when you can do it.
Yeah. I'll, Jen, if I can add just a little into that too.
Ew.
I even think that as I coach leaders across the country, just the aspect of listening, right? Being in the space, that intentional listening is just that, right? Like you're not, and I think sometimes the power dynamic and the role gets in the way of feeling that we have to respond to what we're hearing, right?
Yes.
But deep listening is just being still and doing exactly that, listening, right? I think is important, because the insight that you get, especially as you listen across differences, is very powerful and has implication for how you design strategy, what you do as you move forward, and all of the particular things. But I think so, I think that's so key.
Listening for the aspirations, listening for the fears, right? Like what's underneath the words.
Yep.
That's what you are listening for. Clues about the organizational culture, right? The community's aspirations and needs. Anyway, really important work. Okay, my turn to ask a question. I'm gonna switch it up, and we've been talking about like these intimate spaces where leaders will often have conversations one-on-one, small group, as they should be. But part of the job of the leader, like let's imagine you're a principal, right, is to bring the whole community along with you, right? Like those stories and insights that you glean from those stories can't just live in your head. Share broad. How do you do it? And especially that builds trust and dissolves things that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, so I think one of the most basic tactical things that matter is like that reporting back, right? Like as part of your entry plan, we talk about how you want to be transparent on the front end and share kind of what your plan is around what you're going to be doing there during entry. But part of that is also holding yourself accountable on the back end, right? Like we had like knowing like, hey, this is where I'm going to share with you what I've learned, not as a period, but as a comma, right? I think that's so important as we think about that report is another place to say, hey, this is what seems to be true. Here's my sense making, and here's what's the like, here's how you can keep weighing in. Here's how I'm going to keep testing myself and keep learning. So I think that's a fundamental piece. I think the other piece that's so important is that storytelling aspect of it, right? And being able to figure out how are these narratives that you're learning, how are you starting to identify, the stories that are not serving your community well, and what is that new narrative that can come from it. And I think about, one of the leaders that we worked with that had a couple of narratives that they were wrestling with. They were wrestling with how did the school system fit within the larger community, right? And this is a school system that in part served a large Indigenous population. And, they were in small groups with Indigenous elders that were telling them, this doesn't there's harm here. There's harm that's historical, that goes like centuries of legacy. There's harm that is proximate, that is happening this year. And that person had to hold that. And both, from an identity standpoint, as a Latinx leader, like that was complicated. Here I'm representing the system of harm that I also have perceived harm from in myself at times, right? But they needed to show and be able to create space for people to see, oh no, we're going to start telling a new story. This is going to be a place where you will be heard, where we're going to listen, yet that we're going to acknowledge the harm of the past and move forward. And part of that was creating the space, telling these stories, elevating these voices that had not been heard previously, both internally and externally. But the other part was really looking at the system itself and being like, hey, we've got this reputation for nothing happening fast. We can't get the work done. And so they started thinking about, how do I start telling a different story at every meeting, right? People are going to give us feedback. And when we show up the next day for the next day of professional learning, they're going to see that we did something different. They're going to see that we can actually deliver on promises right away. We're going to start having different voices show up at board meetings and, listen to paraprofessionals, listen to parent liaisons and hear those perspectives. And so by figuring out who shows up, who's delivering the message, what that message is, and being really clear about how it's different than what has happened in the past, we start to change these narratives and people actually start to get that energy of, oh, there's something different going on here. I want to be a part of this. I want to lean in. And other people start feeling more comfortable taking those risks.
Adam, one of the things that I know you lifted up in your specific research on the job of communicating with your community is the importance of disrupting deficit thinking, deficit language, deficit narratives. Can you say a little bit more about that, or Rodney, anybody who wants to chime in? I think that's so important too.
Yeah, I'll take a first pass here and then Rodney jump in with me, right? Like, I think one of the things that we get bogged down in are these stories about the most negative aspects of our communities, right? Like we talked to so many leaders who told us things like, it's the these kids language at the classroom, it's the these parents language at the school level, or the these teachers. And what the leaders we know did was take those statements and throw the table upside down, right? And so they thought about things like, it's not like, it's what if we thought about our schools, if we loved our communities with the same radical love that we have for our own kids, for our own other aspects of our identity, we wouldn't talk about them in those ways. And we start changing that language, right? So it's more like, we are serving kids that are the best kids that each and every family has to bring to us, that have the same hopes and dreams for their kids as every single community does. That every resource that we could possibly need is within the boundaries of our community. It might look different than my biases or perceptions are expecting from other places I have been. It might sound different. I might not fully understand it, but it's there. And it's my job to help unleash that and really see all of these aspects and what's going on within the community as assets, and helping others reframe that through the language we use.
Yeah, that's great, Adam. Thank you for the question too, Jen, because as I think about how school systems are designed, right? Like school systems are designed in silos, right? Like you have these multiple silos. And in those silos, people have a set of experiences and they create their own narratives and their own stories. And I think as leaders, how do we disrupt the silos to help people to understand what a full community needs, right? So that's why the listening engagements are extremely important, right? To be able to, like, here are what our students are saying, hear what our families are saying, hear what our administrators, right? Here's what a full community is saying, and being very public and transparent with that, right? And then creating spaces to bring these multiple groups together to be able to design around a set of actions, right? Like it's just not the responsibility of the central office or the responsibility of a particular group, but designing in community, right, is extremely, I think, important to be able to disrupt the negative narratives.
Yeah, and it's hard to get through tough times with a community when you don't have an aspirational vision
Yes.
to hold on to.
Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So I know we're reaching quickly our question and answer time. So I was hoping I could just kind of throw one last quick whip around towards us to share. And I think it'll actually bridge well, because I'm not surprised. I took a peek at the Q&A questions already, and the first one already speaks to this, right? Like folks are getting burned.
Yeah.
Folks are tired. This is hard work at entry. And then to be thinking about, we talk about using it at re-entry. We talk about these leadership roles. And, let's just each share some ideas. Like we know that this doesn't happen unless we care for ourselves, we care for our communities, and we care for others. Like, what are the tips and things that we've learned from these leaders that really have helped sustain some of these people for, multiple times what you'd expect a superintendent to be in the role or a principal to be in the role?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I remember a leader within a non-for-profit space intentionally incorporating particular sustainable practices throughout her calendar. So she did not have a meeting before 10. She actually had lunch. She actually left at a decent time, right, to take care of herself. I think so many times in these roles, we're taking care of communities, full communities, right? But we also have to take care of ourselves. And I think in terms of communities, I think having spaces for people just to share, like the process of healing is about sharing your stories and the experiences and things of such, and creating those intentional spaces. I think it's very important.
I'm thinking of one of the people we interviewed for the book, Sonia Santelises, the CEO in Baltimore City Schools. And there were a few things that stood out in my mind from that interview. One is she insisted from the beginning that she was not doing this alone. And so she prioritized cultivating a strong team around her, which can sometimes be an afterthought in the beginning when you're pace setting at the beginning of your tenure. It was an intentional move. And that was because she was, I think, insistent that her life be integrated, that it wasn't as necessarily about work-life balance, but a better integration of all of her identities as leader, mother, wife, right? That she insisted from the beginning that she should, be able to bring all of those identities to her work. It helped her create boundaries where she needed to and integrate her life when she needed to as well, meaning, bringing your kid to the event on the weekend, which I certainly did many times as superintendent. But this idea that we can find ways and open the door and normalize it, right? For us to be all that we are, I think is important. Adam, how about you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that came through, and all of us took it away as a learning that wasn't our strength. So I share this as an area for continued growth, is intentionally designing for care at multiple altitude levels, right? Like leaders talked about the things that they did daily for just 5 minutes. Like leaders talked about the things that they did weekly, that, whether it was an exercise class or whether it was a meeting or a, trashy TV show, like everybody named something that let them step out at that quarterly basis, at that yearly basis, like all of these sorts of time bounded places to really be thinking about what's the level of care that I need? Like, what is it integrated? And then what's also the step back reflective space? I think one of the things that we saw a lot was everybody to a T talked about like needing more time for reflection, needing more time to step back and to really capture what they've learned and be able to use that to pivot, but then also to make sure that they're able to hold that empathy. And that came from, sitting with things that you heard. And that really, that mattered as people were able to think about sustaining their work.
Thanks, Adam. I think we should open it up for Q&A in this last little bit.
Yes. So you kind of touched upon the first question, the very thoughtful question that someone asked. So I will skip over to the next question, unless you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I think we should. This is a very meaty question. Can everyone see it?
I will read it just for,
Yeah. All right,
yeah.
go for it.
Okay. A week doesn't go by without discovering news of a committed, equity-minded superintendent somewhere in the country, either leaving his or her office, often to enter consulting on the subject, or being forced out by vocal forces that are inhospitable to schools' efforts to support racial and gender equity. Even thoughtful books on these subjects are being banned from school libraries in this highly politicized time. So unless works like yours reach the hands and minds of local school boards who are hiring younger and less experienced educators to serve in these key leadership roles, how is this vicious cycle ever going to end? Turnover of school system leadership every 2 to 3 years, or even less, sadly, will not contribute to meaningful progress on the equity front. Did the district leaders you talked to and research for this book have a brighter view than this?
That's a great question, and I know the person who wrote it, which is wonderful. And this is very much focused on the role of the school superintendent, of course, which is one of many audiences we believe for this book. I have a few thoughts. I mean, I think this is the reality that we're facing right now. I think in some communities worse than others. I think especially communities where demographics have been changing rapidly. These battles are being fought most fiercely, right? So context matters, right? There are other contexts in which it would be, you would get fired for not using the word equity in a forceful way, right? So this is why in the book we talk a lot about knowing who you are in relationship to the context you're entering, like this kind of reflection phase before even going, before starting the job is so crucial. So you know what it is that you're walking into, how to talk about the work in ways that will help you navigate the very difficult politics that we're facing right now. And certainly we definitely get at the political realm in the book. So I'll say that I do think school board members are an excellent audience for the book. And we do need to educate school board members about leadership entry, what their role is in supporting a superintendent's leadership entry, the kinds of conversations that they should be having with their leaders early on, which we definitely get to in the book. There's some specific guidance about how to handle those early conversations, even during your hiring process, so that you know that the match is good with the organization that you've decided to go to. Anyway, lots to talk about, but this is real talk, and I very much appreciate the question.
Thank you so much. The next question, what traits do you look for to ascertain trustworthiness in a team that you inherit and or when you are creating a team?
Great question. Anybody want to take that one?
A quick stab. So that was a context for me as I entered into I inherited a team in my non-for-profit space. And I think what worked for me is being intentional about listening to their hopes, fears, and aspirations. Because I think that we enter into particular context and we bring a whole new thing and not pay attention to, even as JP talked about, the multiple transitions that happen, right? But in that, not just taking care of our community in that way, but taking care of our teams in that particular way too, right? And I think that gives you some insight into the type of leader that you need to be for your team, right? So the same thing that we're modeling for communities, right, which is transparency and trust and relationship building and all of the things. It's the same thing that I think we need to be doing for our own initial teams in that way. So.
Yeah. And if I'd actually like to, throw a provocation in there with the question, right? Like, one of the things that I think we've experienced is to ask yourself, what have you done to be trustworthy, right? Like, oftentimes what we experience as someone else's not trustworthiness is a response to our missing a mark when it comes to what they need to trust us as the leader, right? And so as we look at that question, I think about, like, we share some strategies in the book about, like, what are the moves that you are making to show competence? Where are you showing that you trust other people, and giving them space to lead, to communicate, to be vulnerable, right? So I think there's some of that move too, is like, start with yourself. Think about that inward journey. How can you be critical? And then, without a doubt, some people will not perform. They will, you'll give tests and you'll find, is it a matter that you can coach? Can you develop? Or is there a harder conversation to have? And that will happen. But just like we say, spend more time on these initial steps, like spend a lot of time thinking about how you're building your own trustworthiness, and realizing that's going to look different for different people.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to add much, except that there is a section in the book where we talk about how to assess the strengths and assets and potential areas of growth of your team, so that you can make smart decisions. And we definitely recommend not blowing up your team early on, unless there is real corruption on the team. Yeah, as a general rule.
Thank you. What do you all hope is the future of what comes from this book, and what have you learned along the journey?
I think we've talked a lot about what we learned along the journey. So I would love to just focus more on the change that we hope to see happen as a result of the book. I mean, I think that the subtitle says it all. We want to empower schools and communities, right? We want there to be a better chance that the change that we're making in our schools and communities is the change that our communities want. And I saw there was a question further down, I think even from one of our faculty members, like, what happens when there is no one community? And there never really is, right? But multiple perspectives within one community. It's your job, right, to try to coalesce that community around a more common aspirational vision of what's possible. But I think we're trying to not do to our schools and districts and communities like we have in the past. And as servant leaders, right, help them bring a vision to life that's meaningful. Any additional thoughts on that, Rodney or Adam?
I'll just say just one overarching kind of thing, even as I looked at all of the questions, as leaders, I want to make sure that we disrupt the notion of the savior complex and we have all the answers.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we understand that under the right conditions, people can actually solve their own problems. So as leaders, how do we create the conditions to bring people's experiences and voices in, and to lead alongside with them and not for them, right? So I think that's just important to consider as we think about the complexities of this work.
Thank you. We probably have time for maybe a couple more questions.
Maybe do you want to look through and pick your one that's most speaking to you or feels new, and then I'll put up the slide to close this out. There's just so many good ones. I didn't want to go in order because it's so hard to pick.
Yes, I'm sorry. Who do you want to pick the question? Would you like me to select one?
Sure, because I don't have time to scan all of them.
They're
go
so
for it.
good. Yes. Okay, this is a good one. Younger systems leader here. How do you loop generational gaps and shifts into entry here? As a new generation of leaders emerge, how do you think the context may shift around entry? Have you been talking to millennial/Gen Y leaders around entry styles? And if so, how might that compare to Gen X or exiting baby boomers, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what the book is about, right? This kind of next generation of leaders are really changing the paradigm on leadership. It's extremely exciting. And even I saw another question about the how of this work. I mean, I think they're teaching us new ways for how to do leadership entry. We wrote an article recently as an example about, you know, kind of the big shifts in leadership entry. And instead of doing kind of the typical, you know, one-on-ones and focus groups and, you know, which is all wonderful, you know, we see people using things like community circle process, right? That has a real focus on healing. People are leaning into asking different kinds of questions. We mentioned that article about, you know, this concept of appreciative inquiry, which is not a new idea, but maybe newly being embraced, right, by a younger generation who want to, are, you know, just trying to solve technical problems, but trying to embrace and create a vision that we've never seen before. I don't know, Rodney, what do you think?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think that the context of leadership is shifting, and not so much regarding like the age gap, but more of the context, right? So as we think about empathy, right, we're using empathy and heart, and we're humanizing leadership in this moment and in this time, because of just how the context is shifting and changing. So I think a leader at 52 and a leader at 32, the leadership styles will shift and change because it's fluid, because of the context that's changing over time. Leadership is becoming more humanizing, right? Yeah. And more technical, right? And I think it's a balance between the two that we have to consider now, no matter where you are in the spectrum of age.
Mm-hmm. We've learned so much these last few years, haven't we, too, about what leadership that sustains looks like. It's yeah, this next generation is teaching us a lot, that's for sure. I know we're out of time, and I do want to make sure everybody sees our email addresses real quick. Yeah, oh, just, and actually, Adam, just if you could pause on that, just a reminder that the book, we hope will do the things that are on the slide. We want everyone to understand better the challenges and opportunities, use these dimensions to design their own unique leadership entry plans, ones that are equity focused and human centered. That's what we're all about. And then if you want to talk more, let us know, like contact us, don't hesitate. We would love to hear from you. We would love to know what people think about the book. And we do have a course that's open to professionals on leadership entry. It doesn't happen till the spring, but if anybody wants to learn more about that, we'll make sure to get that information out there pretty soon, especially for those who are changing roles, changing up their leadership, or starting in new roles in new communities. We want to help. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. I wish we had another hour to talk about all of this. Maybe next time. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take good care.
Bye.